This week we're talking about learning disabilities. And when we look at learning disabilities, we're looking at the IDEA criterion for determining a learning disability. The biggest component is that the child does not achieve at expected age and ability levels. You can look at two different models. One is a discrepancy model. So what the discrepancy model says is that we look at a child's IQ and then we look at their achievement. We basically subtract those two numbers, and if there is a wide enough gap, we say the child has a learning disability. That is the kind of old school way of determining whether a child has a learning disability, and we've moved to more of a response to intervention approach. It's county by county at this point. The most recent legislation in IDEA actually kind of encouraged the response to intervention approach as opposed to the discrepancy approach. Most counties in this area do use an RTI approach because the discrepancy approach solely bases the decision on a number, whereas RTI takes into account how the student is performing when given interventions or when given additional supports. And even though we still need to know that the child has an average IQ score and we can see where the child may be struggling with achievement, we also need to understand the child as a whole person, especially as it relates to the interventions and not just a number. There's a number of different areas where a child may qualify for a learning disability. They're listed here on this particular slide. It could be one or several, and there's different batteries of tests that are used during the screening process that speak specifically to each of these areas. The link that you'll see on the screen is on Canvas, so you can go and click on kind of a student explanation of what a learning disability is. As with all assessments, we need to make sure that when we're doing a eligibility evaluation for a student with a learning disability, that the tests that are administered to the student are done by trained professionals. They're reliable and valid, and they're in the child's native language. You don't just use one thing to make this determination. You use several things, and when you go through eligibility for any disability, there is almost always an IQ test of some sort, and then some sort of achievement. So for a student with learning disabilities, you may be looking at something like a Wechsler IQ and then maybe a Woodcock-Johnson, and you do a complete battery. If you suspect that there are other issues going into the evaluation, you could do something where you're doing an assessment for working memory or processing speed. You may specifically extend it to do something like key math, where if you want to know more detailed information about the math issues that may be going on, or you could do something specifically related to writing or reading for the assessment. Any of those are fine, and they're common when you're looking at evaluation for learning disabilities. In thinking about the components of a learning disability, one of the things that you need to exclude is that the disability is not caused by something else. So if we are saying that the disability is caused by a low IQ score or by some sort of other larger issue, then we wouldn't qualify a student for a learning disability. The assumption with a learning disability is that there is this presumption of a central nervous system kind of issue that's going on, where a student's not processing the information in the same way that other children are processing information. The other piece of this is that the IQ score is within normal range. So when we're talking about learning disabilities, we're talking about an average IQ. And as always, we need to make sure that there's an educational impact when we're looking at learning disabilities. You'll see in different print, different books, different media, that the range for estimates for the prevalence for learning disabilities really does kind of go all over the place. Unless there's educational impact, then a student may not even qualify for services. So we have this kind of unknown number of children who are in schools with learning disabilities but are doing well or have good strategies to help them accommodate for their challenges. So the estimates range from 1 to 30% of the school population. There's a website that I link you to that says it's one in five people have a learning disability. So 1 in 5 people, if you translate that to school age, then you're getting back to that kind of 25%. So it's still within that range. The federal government now also counts preschoolers. If they have a learning disability, could count in the federal count. Having a learning disability as a preschooler is pretty difficult to identify, and we probably won't see a lot of that within our school systems. Typically in this area, the counties that surround us, you'll see developmentally delayed or speech first, because a child just doesn't have exposure to enough knowledge in order to have a learning disability label. The number of students identified has increased over the years. We can talk about ADD, ADHD the same way. Is it that, we have more children with learning disabilities, or are we more accepting? Do we have better ways to identify students? Or is it a reflection of the curriculum and standardized testing that now more students are struggling because they don't have options to express themselves in more than one way, therefore they cannot accommodate for their own disability? So, whether or not it's an identification, if it's a symptom or a cause of other issues, the point is that we have seen an increase in the number of students identified. When you look at the breakdown of where students with disabilities are receiving their education, primarily you'll see the regular classroom followed by a resource room or some sort of separate class. But overwhelmingly, you'll see that students with learning disabilities are in the public school systems. And most of the time, they are in either a co-teaching situation or included into the general education classroom with supports. Like most of our disability categories that we look at, we do not have one cause for a learning disability. There are a couple suspected areas that we can attribute learning disabilities to, including trauma to the central nervous system. There are genetic and hereditary influences that we do know exist. So if a child has a parent or a sibling with a learning disability, they are more likely to have one themselves. So you do see a genetic component to it. But we don't exactly know how it carries through families or why it skips over some children, or both parents can be learning disabled but the children aren't. We're not sure how that all kind of comes into play. Biochemical abnormalities, and then environmental possibilities, whether that's in utero, whether that's after the child's born, exposure to toxins. We don't really have one answer for why learning disabilities exist. When talking about students with learning disabilities, we do talk about a pretty wide range of characteristics, because different students may qualify for different academic areas. You may see comorbidity with ADD or ADHD, or just problems with attention in general, and sometimes that's a processing issue. Students with learning disabilities, especially those who have executive functioning issues, take a long time to process, or they take a long time to kind of sift through the information in their head. So what actually may appear as inattention is actually the student thinking. And then sometimes those students who are spending a lot of time kind of processing get off track, and their eyes pick up or their ears pick up something else in the room, and they kind of get off task. So you may see that. You may also see poor motor skills associated with learning disabilities. So if you're working with younger grades, these kids sometimes have difficulty manipulating scissors or holding pens and crayons correctly. Older kids with learning disabilities often have poor handwriting as well. Psychological process deficits, information processing problems, and sometimes that ties into social awareness and social interactions, because some of these students have difficulty picking up on the kind of subtle cues that happen around them with their peers or with teachers or with adults. They don't always read people correctly, and sometimes it's a matter of that slow processing, just kind of not getting the information fast enough and be able to make determinations. Other times it's just that they don't have that awareness. And then you'll see, depending on the specific student, it could be oral language, reading, writing, math, any of those kind of specific areas that a child may struggle with. And then we talked a little bit already about the social skill deficits, because they just like they're not picking up the academics as quickly and they're having trouble processing the academics, it happens the same way with the social skills. I mean, if you think about social skills and socialization as an instructional method, then the students miss out on those cues too and miss out on that instruction because there's something amiss in their learning processes. A student with a learning disability and language difficulties may have one, two, or maybe all of these issues. It could be just with comprehension, just with decoding. It could be just writing or speaking or organizing their thoughts, or you may see that they have extremely poor comprehension but fabulous word recognition. That's very common with kids with executive functioning issues. They just don't process the information quickly, but they can read like the Dickens and know all these words, but they have no idea what they just read. So just something to think about. It could be, again, any of these, any mix of these, strengths and weaknesses could be kind of all over the board. There is a link for dyslexia, and I did give you the video to watch on dyslexia specifically. Just so you know, dyslexia is a very, very, very small percentage of students who have learning disabilities. So dyslexia is very uncommon, actually, and cannot be easily determined by teachers. So there's a little video on that for you to take a peek at when you have a moment. Just like the language difficulties, math could be all over the place. It could be something just with word problems, not understanding how to read and kind of extract information from word problems. It could be copying shapes and numbers, understanding concepts, or it could be strictly computational. It could be a mix. There could be strengths and weaknesses. So just know that there's a pretty wide range, and each student is going to have their own profile, if you will, when it comes to strengths and weaknesses, both within a subject area. So within mathematics, they're still going to have strengths. They may be great at spatial relationships, but awful at computation. Or, great at word problems, but awful at, copying shapes and patterns. That may be their weakness. So just know that each student's going to have a profile within each subject and within academics in general. Again, there's a link to this Calculia on here. It's pretty intriguing, so make sure that you're ready to actually watch the screen and not just listen to this one, because you'll want to engage in that particular video. Students with learning disabilities sometimes have some social and emotional difficulties, not all, but sometimes. But if you can imagine the frustration that goes along with not being able to learn like everyone else is seemingly doing without difficulty, you can imagine that there are going to be some issues that come out of that, which naturally are things like low self-esteem and poor self-concept. Obviously, students who are younger tend to have less of these issues because they haven't had to struggle for so long, but by the time kids are in middle and high school, you may see an increased level of frustration and kind of apathy towards school in general. These students may, like I mentioned earlier, have difficulty with social cues and making friendships. So it's important to remember that your students with learning disabilities, even though their disability is academic in nature, the trickle down does go into the socialization as well. So sometimes they need support with those relationships with peers. There are some signs for preschoolers who may be at risk. Not that I want anyone to go out and diagnose any preschoolers, but when you kind of look at a child who has a learning disability and then you go back in history and you look at what they were like as a preschooler, you'll see some of these characteristics with those particular students. But what's important for parents to know is if they're seeing a number of these characteristics or a great deal of these characteristics, that things like Child Find are available, so students can be evaluated at age 3 to see if maybe there is a developmental delay, there is something going on. So it's just important to know that these characteristics could potentially be telling of a later issue, which could be something like a learning disability. In thinking about how you teach students with learning disabilities, a couple of things